This research dynamo has been following a ketogenic diet since August of 2016, losing 80 pounds. Yes. Also gaining a passion for research along the way. She now works full-time alongside Dave Feldman at cholesterolcode.com, dedicating herself to unraveling the mysteries of cholesterol, metabolism, and how this relates into the ways the body protects itself through a mix of self-experimentation and research into the established literature. Ladies and gentlemen, Siobhan Huggins.
All right, so my name is Siobhan Huggins, and I have one thing to announce before I get started, which is on May 1st, it will be my 1-year anniversary of working with Dave, full-time. So the past year has been utterly wonderful, and along the way, I've been researching cholesterol metabolism and the immune system, but I've also been looking into one other thing, and that is inflammation. So this might be the general picture you get when you think of inflammation, which is anti-inflammatories, take your turmeric, all that sort of stuff. And inflammation tends to get a bit of a bad rap, even in the low-carb community, which I find pretty sad. Before I started studying it for myself, most of what I heard about inflammation was in regards to what inflammatory foods you should be eating, how inflammation causes certain diseases, and how inflammation is pretty much a burning fire that must be put out at all costs. This is not to say these views are not understandable. After all, inflammation is associated with plenty of bad things. I think we're all aware of that. And I've even experienced this myself. Brace yourselves. In case you didn't believe that I have lost 80 pounds, this used to be me. Before I went keto in August of 2016, I did in fact look like this, ruminant appreciation going on there. And I had a lot of signs pointed towards me having active inflammation. For example, obesity itself, tied to inflammation. Other problems I had, chronic joint and back pain, acne, depression, eczema, all have been linked to inflammation. It's not just me either. Whenever I looked into autoimmune disorders or other issues like heart disease, diabetes, and even Alzheimer's, I found more and more references to inflammation. It seemed wherever I turned, people were facing some sort of problem associated with this. And people were scared. Even more interestingly, once I changed my diet, these signs of inflammation disappeared completely. My weight has been the most visible change, obviously, but my joint pain, eczema, gone. I went from living in a constant fog of depression, which is life-ruining, to actually feeling content with my life and making friends and feeling confident enough to come to conferences like this one. Perhaps all of these changes had something to do with ketogenic diets being called anti-inflammatory, but we'll get back to that later. If you know me, you probably already know where this is going. If something is considered harmful or bad, I want to understand it, and this is definitely true for inflammation as well. To understand inflammation, I found myself asking several questions. For example, yeah, that'd be nice. Temporary delay as we fix my mic.
We're all about temporary delays. All right, you can go hands-free now.
Okay, hands-free. So I found myself asking, what is inflammation? What does it actually do? What do we use it for? And why does it relate to disease? And what does diet have to do with it? So as I began to investigate the question of what inflammation was, I quickly found out that inflammation is highly regulated. It's not this wildly burning fire that people talk about it as. There's actually a lot of redundancy built in as far as signaling goes to make sure it happens properly so it can serve its purpose. And yes, I did say purpose. So this purpose that inflammation is used for tends to revolve around the necessity of communicating a problem. So here's an artery, simplified. No glycocalyx here, sorry. But similar to how you might call for emergency services if you're hurt or in trouble, Sometimes cells that are in trouble will also call for help, such as the purple cell here, that's an endothelial cell. And sometimes patrolling immune cells, like the white blood cell there, will be the ones to spot the problem first and start the inflammatory response. Either way, communication is a necessity to get the job done and everything back to normal, and inflammation is involved all the way through this process. Let's take, for example, a case where a virus has gotten into the bloodstream. Not good news. Obviously, this is a problem because pathogens can result in damage to tissue, death to cells, and even death to us. We don't want this happening. It's a problem that needs to be taken care of as soon as possible before things can get worse, and this necessity triggers an acute inflammatory response. As soon as the pathogen is spotted, a signal will be sent out. This can originate from an immune cell, but in this case, the endothelial cell has seen it first, so it's sending up the alarm. And endothelial cells are cells that line our blood vessels and arteries. You might hear them in regards to atherosclerosis and stuff like that. So as soon as it sees the pathogen and recognizes it through certain receptors, this will cause a cascade of reactions, one of the results being that these endothelial cells will make a class of protein involved in the inflammatory process called a cytokine or pro-inflammatory cytokine. Although it may seem surprising, endothelial cells are actually really involved in regulating various functions of both energy metabolism and the immune system. They've been called active participants, early responders, all this type of stuff. So they're not quite as passive as they're often made out to be. So beyond reacting to stimuli like inflammation, they also help alter blood flow during emergencies and help traffic immune cells to areas that need them, and they also set off some of these initial alarms as well. The way they set off this alarm, and you don't need to understand all this, is through something I mentioned before called cytokines. These are signaling proteins. That's really all that means. There are many different types, as you can see, and they all interact with the immune cells in different ways. But a general way to think of cytokines is that they, just like a 911 call or a dispatch call between officers, can be used by immune cells to communicate with each other and with surrounding cells that can understand the message being sent. One message that cytokines can send is that there's a problem. And this can attract immune cells to wherever the message is coming from. Oh, look, they're on high alert. They see something is wrong. And these immune cells can make their own cytokines with a slightly different message, and the endothelial cells will react to this. One possible reaction, for example, is expressing something called adhesion molecules. This is sort of like a sticky thing that immune cells can grab onto, get to the area easier, and stay there. But this isn't the only result of the inflammatory signaling. So inflammatory signaling is hideously complicated, but it's a complicated communication network. It has to be. Another possible result of inflammatory signaling, for example, is vessel dilation, seen here, so they're expanding out. And a small side note is that the cytokine that's doing this can also do another thing, which is cause pain. So pain is actually helpful when there's an injury or infection. It tells you don't touch that, don't walk on that. If you've broken an ankle, sit down, stay still until this is resolved. So pain is often seen as a bad thing, but it's actually extremely helpful, especially if you consider if you didn't feel pain, you'd be using a broken arm, making it worse, all that type of stuff. You may recognize from your own experiences or from TV shows or movies how they say you can tell a cut or a scrape is infected because it's red and hot to the touch. This redness and heat are both results of inflammation causing blood vessel dilation. And this actually has a purpose as well. It causes increased blood flow, which serves to bring immune cells to the area, and it could possibly also serve other uses as well. Although this isn't exactly the same as local inflammation, the increase in temperature from fever has been shown to help immune cells do their job more efficiently. And in fact, they make a note in several of these fever studies that fever is actually conserved pretty thoroughly Even reptiles or cold-blooded animals, for example, will go up and bask in order to simulate a fever if they get sick. Fever increases the rate of immune cells entering circulation, so there's more of them there to help out. Adhesion of immune cells to sites of infection is also increased. That's helpful. Increased cytokine production, meaning increased communication. That's a good thing. And many, many others. The other thing that fever can do is it can make it harder for viruses or bacteria to replicate, so it slows their progression down. And that's an added bonus as well. Although it's speculative on my part, I do wonder if this is also true in the case of the increased heat from local injury or local infection as well. But what if the pathogen we're dealing with is really hard to knock out? It's managed to get deeper into the tissue, and normally endothelial cells are very snug and close together. They're selectively permeable, which just means they're really picky about what gets past them. But if a virus does get past them, immune cells can use inflammatory signaling to tell the cells to loosen those tight junctions so they can move past them to get to the problem area. And so they can get to work. Sometimes the resident immune cells aren't enough to handle a problem, and if it's big enough, it can result in something called an acute phase response, so a very sudden event that's responding to something. This is essentially when inflammatory signaling communicates with other cells further away, and this triggers things like a production of needed materials. You can think of this a bit like calling the FBI for a widespread problem that can't be handled by the local authorities. It has benefits in providing specialized equipment, more backup, and help from outside organizations like the liver and even the fat tissue. Remember how it was mentioned before in one of the previous presentations, how fat tissue can express inflammatory cytokines, and this can result in a disruption of their function. It can actually work in the reverse as well, where inflammation from outside the fat tissue will hit it, and this will result in essentially insulin resistance in the fat tissue. And this happens during infection, by the way. The systemic inflammation response can result in an increase in production of things that are helpful during infection or injury, not only triglycerides from that leaky fat tissue, but also sources of fuel for immune cells like glucose, substances that you can use to make antigens, or things like CRP, which is the donut-looking thing. And the CRP helps clear out dead tissue, even pathogens themselves, and oxidized LDL too, interestingly. Throughout the entire inflammatory process, immune cells are constantly balancing the level of inflammation in order to coordinate an appropriate response. This is not something as simple as anti-inflammatory versus inflammatory factors, however. As Amber mentioned, nothing is so simple as a balance scale. It just doesn't work that way. This fine-tuning of the inflammatory response is more of a carefully composed algorithm or program that's taking in a lot of input to change the response in order to make sure it gets it right. There are also certain factors in place, like dummy receptors, which take inflammatory factors and just degrade them, probably to make sure inflammation doesn't go too high. And this is important, as if the response isn't strong enough, the problem would be prolonged or never resolve. And likewise, if the response is too strong, it could result in problems like sepsis, which can be fatal. Once the infection has been taken care of and any dead or injured cells have been cleared, immune cells switch to primarily anti-inflammatory signaling and release things like growth factors. This helps to replace any cells that may have been lost during the battle or injury, and they also form new tissue in the area if necessary, all of which leads to an eventual resolution of the injury. A happy ending, hopefully. The more I looked into inflammation, the more I began to realize that in a lot of situations it was actually a good thing. For all the times it had been said as if it were a naughty word, inflammation seems to do quite a lot of vital things that help us in the long run. While it is true that if inflammation is overwhelmed, it can result in bad outcomes like sepsis, as I mentioned, but it wasn't that inflammation was the source of this initial injury. Rather, it was that some sort of damage or injury was causing inflammation. It didn't appear as though inflammation suddenly occurred for no reason either, but rather that there was a demand for it due to a problem. This didn't necessarily have to be in response to a pathogen either. That's just an easy example I can use. The triggers for inflammation are numerous, and the specifics of what it does varies greatly. That's why there's such a complex network it can use. But it seemed to be something that was necessary to deal with everyday life and the damage that comes with it. Life is damaging. We have to learn to deal with that. Its first use, as we already mentioned, is as a defense mechanism against outside invaders. In these cases, inflammation is used to signal for help from the immune system as a locator for where the damage is. And it can also be used to signal to other parts of the body to produce materials that may be needed to deal with the problem, as well as many other minute effects that help as well. The second was addressing physical damage. So, for example, a cut or a burn. In the case of physical wounds, inflammation can be used to coordinate sterilization of the area, make sure no bacteria has gotten in or anything like that, clearance of damaged or dead tissue, as well as recruiting other immune cells to the area if their specialized skills are needed. Eventually, this process leads to repair of the injury and sometimes strengthening of the area as well. Lastly was inflammation's involvement in general day-to-day maintenance. Where small amounts of inflammation can be used to make adjustments to metabolic responses or something called adaptive tissue remodeling, which is exactly what it sounds like, tissue changing to adapt to a stimuli. And this is helpful in maintaining homeostasis in response to certain stressors that we may come across, such as high blood pressure in the arteries or even fat tissue growth. In order to grow fat, you need inflammation. Because I was researching other things like the immune system in tandem, I noticed that the three-set pattern, pathogen defense, wound repair, and preservation of homeostasis, is actually reflected in the duties of an immune cell called a macrophage, and they're really cool, by the way. This paper described the roles of the macrophage, including pathogen defense, wound repair, and maintenance or growth of tissue. One thing I want to mention, by the way, is I actually came across a study that was talking about macrophages, and it was talking about how they're actually involved in atherosclerosis. So the foam cells that you hear about are actually macrophages full of cholesterol, and this study was talking about selectively killing them to get rid of the problem. This will become a recurring theme, by the way. So what about atherosclerosis? The things linked to increased risk or worsened atherosclerosis included things like certain infections, periodontitis, cytomegalovirus, and others, and some of these pathogens are also found in atherosclerotic plaque as well. Injury to the artery or endothelium, which can result in things like endothelial dysfunction. One of the ways they can actually induce atherosclerosis in animal models is to insert a wire into the artery and scrape around in there, and that'll induce it. There are also signs of repeatedly ruptured and healed plaques within arteries of people who have died from heart attacks as well, so it seems like this is perhaps a repeated injury problem, at least in part. In certain adaptations to stressors like high blood pressure can also lead to worsened risk. It's also worth noting that some of these things are also reflected in things like morbidity of bipolar disorder, Alzheimer's disease pathology, and other issues tied to inflammation as well. As for Alzheimer's, there's actually a couple studies showing that certain infections can worsen your risk of Alzheimer's and that the amyloid plaque may be antimicrobial, things like that. So it seemed to me that inflammatory signaling in so-called inflammatory diseases could really just be reflecting times when the immune system was activated in one way or the other. So this could be in response to a physical injury or an illness or some other form of disruption or problem. It may very well be the case that inflammation isn't some evil villain lurking behind every corner, the mastermind behind all chronic disease. Instead, it could be something more like this. Instead, I find it far more plausible that inflammation is correlated to so many bad outcomes because it is a response to the events that lead to them. In other words, if it's like blaming the fire alarm for, your kitchen repeatedly being set on fire, you wouldn't, say it's a fire alarm issue. Another way to think of this relationship is to imagine that I live in a neighborhood where a lot of emergency calls are being made all the time, day in, day out, it just never stops. Living in that neighborhood is also, unsurprisingly, correlated to all sorts of terrible things. High risk of robbery, damage to property, car thefts, and even death. But if I asked you if the high volume of emergency calls was the problem in my neighborhood, you would probably say I was being silly, and when I mentioned, oh, I'm going to classify this issue as an emergency call problem, you just shake your head, probably ignore me. The more likely answer is the problem is whatever is causing the high volume of emergency calls in the first place. In this scenario, inflammation is the 911 calls. It's the signaler that something is wrong, and the crimes are what cause the inflammation. And by the way, that analogy is actually stolen from Dave. Credit given. But all the same, I've seen signs of people trying to inhibit inflammation wherever it occurred, regardless of scenario. So one example is exercise where damage to the muscles results in inflammation. This inflammation can also result in soreness, which people may want to avoid, but some trials have actually shown that using anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen or acetaminophen can interfere with protein synthesis. That means muscle growth, because you need inflammation to grow things. But what about supplementing concentrated antioxidants? Amber spoke on this a little bit, but I'll expand. The general theory behind using them was that exercise causes the production of oxidative particles. That's bad, right? And so this could plausibly lead to damage to the muscle and resulting soreness and inflammation, which we know, that's bad stuff, right? Thus, in an attempt to restore balance with heavy quotation marks between oxidation and antioxidation, antioxidants were supplemented. The problem, as it turns out, is that these oxidative particles can cause damage if there's way too much of them, but they're also used as signaling between cells. And inhibiting this results in impaired muscle growth and also no apparent benefit. So maybe inhibiting inflammation and oxidation during exercise isn't a big deal, but what about actual injury? So you may be familiar with this: RICE, rest, ice, compress, and elevate. This is advice given for sports injuries, and it was coined by the sports doctor Gabe Merkin in the sports medicine book. The point of icing an injury was supposed to be that it would cool the heat of inflammation, but there's actually a problem. Gary Reinl, in this article on rice, commented with this. So he says, nearly everyone who ices today believes they're doing it to prevent inflammation, reduce swelling, and control pain. But here's the problem. Icing doesn't prevent inflammation or swelling, it only delays it. Once tissues rewarm, the inflammatory process resumes, and your body's innate intelligence, nice wording here, sends the correct amount of fluid to the damaged site. Although icing can provide temporary pain relief, numbing just shuts off protective signals that alert you to harmful movement. And the Journal of Athletic Medicine research recently showed that icing actually kills muscle cells. He follows up by saying, icing just doesn't work. It actually screws things up. The article goes on to say that the sports medicine doctor who actually coined the term RICE has walked it back and said he doesn't support it anymore because it doesn't work. There's also this article on This Changed My Practice from the University of British Columbia, where another sports medicine doctor comments further by straight up saying that cooling inhibits inflammation, which is needed to initiate healing. So it seems that even inhibiting inflammation by way of icing could be problematic as well, perhaps because inflammation has a purpose. There are also a few studies on trying to inhibit fever during illness in children, which some studies showing it has no particular benefit and may actually prolong the illness instead of making it get better faster. This is limited in scope, and we don't know if maybe in certain circumstances inhibiting fever is helpful. One thing they did talk about in several of these articles is it may be important if you have a child who is sick with fever, because fever inhibitors can increase comfort. And if you have a screaming, feverish child, this is definitely something to consider if you're willing to make that trade-off. Essentially what they were just saying is they don't really see a huge deal with using fever inhibitors, but that choice should be made under the correct circumstances with the correct information, not with the assumption it's going to make things better, because it won't. Another interesting thing to note is in a lot of these papers on inflammation, on fever, one thing they talk about is there's really no evidence for fever reduction. Even in the ICU, there's just not any evidence for it, but they do it anyway because, I don't know, why not, I guess. So there's another thing I wanted to squeeze in here real quick, which is that the heightened temperature from fever actually produces something called heat shock proteins, and these increase the resilience of our cells to increased temperature. But one thing they also do is increase it to other toxic loads like pathogens, so it helps us help our cells survive. So maybe inhibiting it isn't good, I don't think we know. But in all fairness, this has all been talking about acute inflammation, so something happens, inflammation happens, it resolves, we get better at the end. I have seen it proposed that inflammation isn't always helpful. In some cases, for some reason, it becomes chronic, continuing for years instead of resolving as it's supposed to. So maybe this is a problem, and as a potential solution to this problem, to balance the inflammation, I saw various anti-inflammatory strategies being used. The general impression I got from discussions of anti-inflammatories in general was that they vanquished chronic inflammation akin to Dorothy pouring water on the Wicked Witch and melting her away. Happily ever after. In other words, they stopped inflammation and the diseases that inflammation causes, such as heart disease, in their tracks, and we were better off for it. But it turns out that there are different types of things that could be called anti-inflammatory, and they all work a little bit differently. The first is to interrupt the inflammatory signaling cascade directly. Perhaps in chronic inflammatory conditions like heart disease, we're simply producing too much inflammation, and the conditions could benefit if we reduced it. For example, by inhibiting certain enzymes needed to produce inflammation, which is how aspirin works, or stopping some of the actual signaling, some of those cytokines, from actually working. The latter would be the way that certain anti-inflammatory drugs work, such as this one, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce, so don't try and make me. It clearly does seem to work at inhibiting inflammatory signaling. It says here it reduces the cytokine, it reduces CRP, which goes up when there's inflammation, so it does work doing that. But as far as reduction in stroke, cardioinfarction, and confirmed cardiovascular death, which was their primary endpoint, ultimately the difference was marginal, less than 1% absolute difference. And funnily enough, this was hailed as being better than statins. It's revolutionary because of that 1% difference, just an aside. Which, to be fair, is a reduction. Not arguing that. It's just not a groundbreaking one in my opinion. And as I mentioned before, this drug only targets one cytokine, and to give it the benefit of the doubt, maybe the redundancy in inflammatory signaling kind of outweighs whatever benefit it has. But another unfortunate thing is that in the case of death from all causes, all-cause mortality at the bottom there didn't change. They noticed an increase in death from infection and sepsis. Whoops. Perhaps it's not necessarily an issue with the actual inflammatory signaling itself, though. Rather, maybe there's an imbalance somewhere else, like oxidative stress. Perhaps then, supplementing antioxidants could help with atherosclerosis, or just in general. Amber has already pointed out why using plants to do this may not work as well, and they skip that step by just going for a concentrated form in the form of supplements. As mentioned before, oxidants in the body can cause damage to cells and wreak havoc if out of control. And as a result, this leads to inflammation as a response to that damage. So perhaps if we attempt to tip the scales a bit by supplementing antioxidants, we can neutralize this threat, and avoiding the damage and resolve chronic disease. What do you think?
Yes.
Okay, so I quickly noticed that the epidemiology of supplementation can be a bit contradictory, with some sources saying there's benefit and others suggesting none. But I decided to skip this problem by looking at placebo-controlled, randomized control trials, which is like the gold standard. So maybe this will help us answer this question. The results did give a pretty solid conclusion. Antioxidants don't appear to have much effect on actual hard outcomes. Surprise! In this study, for example, they tested the effects of supplementing vitamin E and vitamin C on cardiovascular events, cardiovascular mortality, and all-cause mortality. Neither made any difference whatsoever beyond vitamin E possibly increasing risk of hemorrhagic stroke. The results of this study are echoed by many other randomized trials, and they all had similar results. Some had a couple differences, like a couple suggested increased mortality with supplementation. Oh well. This is just a list of examples. You don't have to read it all, take a picture, whatever. But I wanted to have this list so you could kind of see what I was talking about here, because the more I studied inflammation, the more I began to notice parallels between symptoms of chronic disease like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and acute responses like infection or injury. This inflammatory signaling that we're seeing, we see in infection, but this has downstream effects like higher CRP, an inflammatory marker, or even disrupted handling of glucose, in other words, insulin resistance. You can become temporary insulin resistant from infection, or other things, and these things are actually all helpful in the short term during infection, things like that. Most of this is reflected in lab work I see coming from diabetics. You have the insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, you have the hyperglycemia, high CRP, low HDL, high trigs, all that good stuff. And it's also reflected in things that increase risk of cardiovascular disease. These same changes that are meant to be helpful during acute inflammatory responses are in these people all the time. I find that rather suspicious. So over and over again, as I was studying the immune system, atherosclerosis, and diabetes, I saw the same pathways reflected between them, the same mechanism shared, similarities where I really did not expect to see them. So why is this? Why is there so much overlap between acute problems and chronic ones? Perhaps, and this is just an idea, perhaps whatever is leading to things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease and other so-called inflammatory disorders is resulting in an inflammatory reaction similar to what happens with infection, but all the time. It never ends. Not because of an unbalanced system, but due to the environment the person is in. If this is true, then it would mean we have things backwards. It's not that inflammation is necessarily causing these diseases, even though it is undoubtedly involved in the pathology. If we were to assign proper causality, we would need to point the finger at whatever is causing the inflammation in the first guess, and I'm sure you already have some guesses on what that is. But if we're seeing chronic inflammation because there's a chronic need for it, what does this actually mean? Normally, inflammation will resolve itself after whatever was causing it goes away. But what if it never does? Perhaps it would just continue going on as a defense mechanism. The alternative of not trying to deal with it may be far worse, after all. It's unlikely anyone in this room would ignore someone breaking into their house every single day, or fires starting in their kitchen, even if it happened all the time, for decades. Would you ever just decide to ignore it? I don't think so. I don't think the body would either. To ignore it would be a death wish, guaranteed. If this was the case, if you took whatever was triggering it away, then the inflammation and everything related to it should resolve. Take smoking, for example. We know this is inflammatory. If every single time you smoked a harmful cigarette, you would be introducing particles into your lungs which cause damage, and as a result, it would cause an inflammatory response. That's not shocking to anyone. So long as you continue to smoke, this will continue to happen. It can never, ever fully resolve. It's just not going to. Perhaps not coincidentally, smoking also increases the risk of things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease as well. The logical solution would be to quit smoking. Remove the damaging agent causing the inflammation, and it should resolve. In this way, you could claim that quitting smoking is anti-inflammatory compared to the alternative, because it helps promote an environment that doesn't require inflammation. The same would be true of any diet or lifestyle change that removed elements that promote the need for inflammation as well. What does all this mean for people saying ketogenic diets are anti-inflammatory? We've already seen what anti-inflammatories do if we introduce them willy-nilly, so what about this case? Not only do people on ketogenic diets talk about inflammation markers like hs-CRP going down, but their symptoms of inflammation are also disappearing or lessening like mine did. This includes not only things tied to inflammation like diabetes, but also things like chronic pain conditions, autoimmune disorders, and mood disorders. There are also now studies, which I think were maybe mentioned before, showing that ketones in and of themselves lower inflammation directly. Does this mean that ketones may inhibit necessary inflammation, such as illness or after injury or exercise, possibly delaying injury, resolution, or muscle growth? Or could it be that there's a redundancy in the signaling and fine-tuning of the response I mentioned earlier? So perhaps, remember that with infection we can become insulin resistant. That would inhibit ketone production. Perhaps, if we need inflammation, we'll just make less ketones. That's a possibility. The studies showing that ketones inhibit inflammatory pathways are generally done by supplementing ketones, not through nutritional ketosis. Currently, the studies looking at mouse models also necessitate caloric restriction because rats aren't as good as we are at making ketones. So it could be that if there's a need for inflammation, like I said, ketones go down to allow that inflammation to take place, and then once it's resolved, it goes back up again. There could also be other mechanisms in place to ensure that this anti-inflammatory effect of ketones don't inhibit inflammation when we need it. I don't think we know this yet. Remember my previous example with quitting smoking? It may not be at all that the benefit from a ketogenic diet is inherently due to the direct inflammation lowering effect. It could actually be, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, that it could just be because we're removing things that cause damage and necessitate inflammation. It's a possibility. So what about a carnivorous diet? This possible benefit from ketogenic diets from removing damaging things may be supported by people seeing benefits from carnivorous diets over even ketogenic ones. Because people on carnivorous diets, they're still usually ketogenic, but it's not necessarily a deeper state of ketosis. So if the benefit is from the anti-inflammatory effect of ketones, how are they seeing improvement? It doesn't make sense. Unless it's because they're removing things that they're sensitive to that are causing damage that necessitate an inflammatory response. Examples from Ambro Hearn and Michaela Peterson also show that this can result in a significant effect, cessation of things like arthritis or mood disorders where they weren't seeing it with ketogenic diets before. So I think that's actually a big hint as to what may be going on. This isn't to say that all people need to do a carnivorous diet. That would be probably a bit silly. But rather it implies that perhaps the chronic diseases we're facing are not a random disruption in inflammation, not an imbalance, not anything like that. But rather that inflammation is related to these diseases because the food and lifestyle that probably most of us were living before necessitates inflammation as, damage control. If this is true, it would mean that if you remove the source of the damage that is triggering an inflammatory response, then the disease should resolve. Berta has already shown this with ketogenic diets. They've also shown it with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease improving and improvement in cardiovascular risk markers. Remember that all of these things tend to go together. We're also hearing anecdotes of autoimmune issues such as arthritis, psoriasis, and others going into remission on ketogenic or carnivorous diets. This is also not even including things like bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, depression, and other mental health issues. These are anecdotes, but they're worth studying, and I think they do imply that these aren't just, genetic mess-ups or anything like that. There's a trigger in the lifestyle that may be causing it. As for the problem of ketones inhibiting inflammation, Exhibit A, this is actually my own data. That first data point, CRP is 48. It's supposed to be under 3. So this is actually lab work I had done while I was sick with a fever and all that sort of thing. So because I work with Dave, it should be assumed I do weird things. This is one of those weird things. So each and every single time I get sick, I go get blood work and CRP goes up. Let's see, the other one is lipoprotein(a). That's also another acute phase reactant. And then once I get better, it goes back down again. I seem to be able to inflame myself just fine, if I may say so myself. Obviously, this has no control group, but just saying. I also have a family member who tests their ketones and glucose pretty regularly and commented to me one day that they noticed their ketones were dropping and glucose was going up, but they hadn't changed their diet or really anything else. It was just a normal day. We both agreed this was kind of weird, and I asked, "How are you feeling?" They said they felt a little under the weather. "Oh," I said, and I think I'd pretty much figured this out. I made a prediction that within a couple days, they would probably start becoming symptomatic of some sort of illness if it didn't pass by entirely, and lo and behold, they did. Because this type of family member is my family, they're also kind of weird. So they decided to increase the frequency of their tracking, and they saw this. This is just a general recreation of what they have. I don't have the actual numbers right now. But essentially what they saw is over the course of getting sick and then sustaining that illness, their ketones dropped and glucose went up. It's worth noting that hyperglycemia is not uncommon for infections. The glucose is used as fuel by the immune cells, so it helps to have it a bit higher. And this continued until everything kind of flatlined, plateaued, stayed where it was. And then, as they began to recover, before their symptoms actually started to recess, ketones went back up, glucose went back down to their normal. So this may lend some credence, although it's an N of 1, to the fact that we may inhibit ketones if we need inflammation around. This would make perfect sense. I'll likewise note I've seen similar readings in my glucose and ketones. I think at one point my glucose went up to like 134 fasted when I was sick. It happens. And ketones also dropped at the same time. This family member just had more data than I did on this. Likewise for exercise, an interesting thing to note is that I sometimes see people post their information on cholesterol code, as you do, and their CRP will sometimes be unusually high, say between 3 and 6, where usually with low carbers it's around like 1-ish. Upon asking what their week looked like leading up to the test, often it is the case that they say they exercise the day before the test or a couple days, or they exercise all the time, that sort of thing. Or exercised on the morning of is another one of these. Remember that CRP is a marker of inflammation. It goes up when inflammation does. So this may suggest that at the very least, we have some data that people on ketogenic diets are able to inflame themselves just fine, even from exercise. It's not a full set of data, more research required, but it's a hint. However, this is not definitive. We need more research for sure. We can't just assume things are true and that it's not a problem until we have more information. So here are some example questions I would like to ask if there are any researchers out there. Do ketogenic diets result in a high ketone environment that inhibits inflammation to any detrimental degree? By that I mean injury resolution or exercise, anything like that. Does it prolong illness? Anything? We don't know. Do ketogenic and carnivorous diets help with things like autoimmune issues due to the anti-inflammatory nature of ketones, or because they remove things that necessitate inflammation as a protective response? We don't know. And many other questions there. So a couple important notes here. None of this encourages not taking medication if indicated by a doctor. I'm not a doctor. I have like no degrees whatsoever. Don't listen to me, but also listen to me. Please discuss any concerns you have, do your own research, verify my findings, please, and contradict them. That would be great, actually. Anti-inflammatories may have benefits, for example, pain relief, where it's appropriate. One thing that's rather difficult is people with chronic pain problems, for example. It's not as easy as, you switch to keto and it goes away immediately. Some people have lingering issues, and that pain can be debilitating. Like, not even kidding. So in that case, perhaps taking an anti-inflammatory makes life livable to the point where they can find the solution. That's important. Or let's say I break a leg, am I gonna take an anti-inflammatory for pain relief? Yeah, duh. This presentation was not medical advice. None of mine are. If you take it as such, I don't know. I should, sorry. So, yeah, confusing, but thanks to the patrons and cholesterol code members, they're the reason I've been able to look into this so much, spend so much time on it. I appreciate them greatly, and thanks to you guys for listening.
I want my name up.